All right, hello everyone. My name's Emma. I'm going to give folks another minute or two to start trickling in and just started the recording, so feel free to, looks like everyone has their camera off, so feel free to keep it off if you don't feel comfortable being recorded. All righty. Oh. Okay, don't know why it's beeping at me. Sorry, y'all. I'm gonna have to minimize this. Okay, I won't click any more buttons, but we're gonna go ahead and get started. So my name is Emma. I use she, her pronouns, and I am the writing specialist for the peer support team. And welcome to everyone who's watching this live, as well as folks who might be watching asynchronously, to the writing workshop that's going to talk about grammar and punctuation. And just a little bit more about the peer support team. So that is composed of 3 people, myself included. So I am the one writing specialist, and we also have 2 quantitative specialists, Ananya and Pratibha, and they will assist with quantitative support. For me, I can help with any type of written or oral communication. So that can be anything from brainstorming paper topics to paper organization or practicing presentation skills. And to schedule an appointment, you can go to my Calendly. I have the link in here, and I will share the slides with everyone. So you'll be able to see all this information. And I also have walk-in hours on Tuesdays at 10 a.m. So, brief agenda for today. We are going to go over grammar, punctuation, tips and tricks to make your writing stronger. We're going to briefly go over APA 7 citations and references, resources that are available to you as students, as well as just general online resources. And then also, I'm hoping to touch upon the content that was requested by a couple of registrants that I wasn't able to incorporate within the main presentation. Please feel free to stop me at any point if you have questions. We do have a lot to cover today, but please just unmute yourself and I will try to answer whatever questions come up. All right, so we are going to gloss over some of the parts of speech just because I think we have more important content to get over, but nouns are going to be your person, your place, your thing, as well as your idea or your quality. So they can have multiple functions, including subject, object, or sometimes neither when that is just a definition. So in this example, veterinarians are doctors of veterinary medicine, and veterinarians aren't doing anything, they're not receiving anything, they just are. So that's an example of when a noun is functioning as neither. And then we have 2 types. So it's going to be our common and our proper nouns. And proper nouns are going to be specific people, places, things, ideas, book titles, things along those lines. And you want to make sure to capitalize those. Alrighty. So pronouns are going to replace a noun and make your writing sound a little bit less repetitive instead of just continually repeating that noun. So they can similarly function as a subject, an object, or neither. Typically, your object pronouns are going to come after your verb. So that's a good way to just kind of glance at it and see That's probably an object pronoun rather than a subject. Also, there are additional types that I'm not going to talk about today, but I did include a hyperlink that you all can click on the slides if you're curious to learn more about the different types. So generally, we have our personal or demonstrative, relative, interrogative, indefinite, and reflective pronouns. The ones that we're going to talk about now are going to be specifically our personal pronouns. So we have the subject pronouns, which are the I, we, you, she, he, they, it. And then the object pronouns, me, us, you, her, him, them, it. And I wanted to bring this up because this is commonly misused in a lot of academic writing, choosing between who and whom. So who is going to function as a subject pronoun, but whom is going to function as an object. So when you're choosing whether or not to use who versus whom, you're going to test using any subject or any object pronouns and see which one sounds better. And if a subject pronoun sounds better, then you're going to go with who. And if an object pronoun sounds better, you're going to go with whom. So in the first example, who or whom did you speak to earlier? The way that you can figure this out is by saying, did you speak to he earlier or did you speak to him earlier? And in that instance, him sounds better. So him corresponds with your object pronouns. So that means you're going to use whom. And in the second example, you are going to use who because he called earlier makes more sense. So articles, another thing that we're not going to go over into great detail, but just know that a and an are going to be your indefinite articles that do not refer to anything specific. And the is going to be a definite article, which refers to something in particular. Verbs, they can function in a variety of ways. Typically, they're going to express an action, they're going to link ideas, and they're also going to function as helper verbs. So they're going to help other verbs do their thing. And then these can occur in the past, the present, and the future. And within those time categories, we have simple progressive, perfect, and perfect progressive. So you guys don't need to memorize all of those. I just wanted to have that in the slides for you to reference at a later date when we talk more about them later. So verbs in academic writing. There are specific contexts in which you want to use a specific tense. So for literature reviews, what you want to do is you want to use past or present perfect. So the way that you would phrase that is multiple studies found or presented. Or in present perfect, you would say multiple studies have found or have presented. That's just the appropriate tense given that context. And then when you are describing what a researcher wrote or did, they did that in the past. So you are going to refer to that in the past as well. So the example under there is Smith discovered, elucidated, ... So results, again, we're going to talk about them in the past. You're going to say anxiety decreased significantly. You're not going to say anxiety decreases significantly because that happened before. So it didn't happen currently. So be sure to check in, like keep an eye on your tenses. And then implications of results and conclusions that you're going to draw, those are going to be presented in the present tense because you're applying what the findings were in the past to what that means today. So you would want to say results indicate or results demonstrate, things along those lines. And one trick that you want to do is you want to maintain verb tense consistency, particularly in the same sentence. So if you're reading your paper and it sounds a little disjointed or choppy, one of the reasons might be that you are switching tenses in the middle of your sentence. I sometimes find myself doing that. It's really easy to do. So just looking back on that would be a great way to identify it. So an example of this is after he drank unclean water, he feels sick. So we transitioned from drank, which is in the past, to feels, which is in the present. So another way that you would want to say that to maintain that consistency is after he drank unclean water, he felt sick, or after he drinks unclean water, he feels sick. The one exception to this that is worth mentioning is that when results that when results are still true today, you want to present them in the present, but you can refer to the results in the past. So like researchers found, so that's the past, because you're talking about the results of the researchers, but you're going to say that penicillin is effective. So that's going to be in the present because penicillin's effective today and it still applies today. Okay, and another thing that we want to look out for with our verbs is when we're using active versus passive voice. So active voice is when the subject performs the action. That is typically a clearer way to communicate in writing and also just when you're speaking. So that would be something like the team made mistakes that delayed the testing for weeks. So who made the mistakes? The team. Goes team mistakes. Or sorry, team made. And then passive voice is when the subject is going to receive the action. So mistakes were made that delayed the testing for weeks. So in that instance, we don't know who made those mistakes. We just know that they were made and that they delayed the testing for weeks. So when you want to decide between using active and passive voice, you typically want to go with active voice. That is almost always going to be overall like better usage, because it's typically clearer and your readers are more readily able to follow what it is you're trying to communicate. Passive voice is also appropriate in specific contexts. So particularly when the action or the recipient of the action is more important than who performs the action. So she was shot and badly injured is just one example. We care more about the fact that she was shot rather than who did the shooting. So that's what you're going to want to kind of differentiate. And then the little meme in the corner is just saying how they kind of, with active voice, you typically are going to have your subject first, followed by your object. And then passive voice, it's typically vice versa. So another way that you can identify whether you're using passive voice is to use the by the test. So if you can add by the into your sentence and it makes sense, then you're probably using passive voice. So in the example above, mistakes were made by the team that delayed the testing for weeks. That makes sense. So we know that that is passive voice. And we will talk a bit more about active and passive voice when we talk about to be verbs. All right, so adjectives, not really going to go over them that much, but they can describe a noun or a pronoun. Adverbs can describe a verb, adverb, or adjective, and then provide examples of both of those. So we have our conjunctions. So conjunctions are your linking words, and they are going to connect words, phrases, or clauses. And we have three main types. So that's going to be your coordinating conjunctions, which are going to link words, phrases, or clauses that are equally important, as well as connect two independent clauses that are equally as important. So your coordinating conjunctions, one way that you can remember them is using the acronym FANBOYS. So that's just for and, nor, but, or, yet, and so. And the example that I have under that is he wanted empanadas or pho for lunch. So those have equal emphasis. It's empanadas or pho, either or, not one like more important than the other. We also have our correlative conjunctions, and that is when you have two conjunctions that are going to be used together. And some examples of those are going to be either or not only and but. So in this instance, we have not only did she ace the test, but she also got an A in the class. And then we have our subordinating conjunctions, which are going to function as linking words for dependent clauses and independent clauses. So with subordinating conjunctions, they will often indicate a cause and effect or some type of contrast between the two different clauses. So in this example down here, I can legally rent a car now that I'm 25 years old. That's indicating the effect of someone turning 25 and now they can legally rent a car. And we'll talk more about these shortly. All right, so last part of speech is going to be our prepositions. So prepositions are going to link pronouns and nouns to other words. And the one thing that I do want to mention about prepositions is that you typically do not want to end your sentences with prepositions because that is a more informal way of writing and it typically is frowned upon within academic writing. So the meme on the right kind of points some fun at that by saying, I don't always end a sentence in a preposition, but when I do, it's not something I'm proud of, and of is a preposition, so don't want to do that. Okay, so on to our independent and dependent clauses. So our independent clauses are going to contain a noun and a verb, and they express a complete thought. And then dependent clauses also contain that noun and a verb, but they do not express a complete thought. The way that you can often identify dependent clauses is by what's called a dependent marker word or subordinating conjunction that we just talked about. So these are oftentimes placed in the beginning of a sentence that would otherwise be independent, but because that word is there, it makes the whole clause dependent. So an example of this is, I went to the store. That is an independent clause, expresses a complete thought, has a noun, has a verb. But if you add when, which is an example of a dependent marker word, when I go to the store, yeah, it still has a noun, still has a verb, but it does not express a complete thought because we don't know like what happened when you went to the store. So that's kind of just a rundown on those. And then the ways that we can connect our different clauses. Also, please feel free to speak up if I'm talking too quickly. I know I'm going through this it's pretty speedy. So slow me down if I need to. For connecting clauses, the way that you would do that with two independent clauses is going to be either using a coordinating conjunction. So again, that is our fanboys. So you're going to do your first independent clause, which is her favorite subject is biostatistics. Then you're going to add a comma, and then you're going to add your coordinating conjunction, which is but. And then she also enjoys history is going to be your independent clause. And we'll go more into this when we talk about punctuation. And then you can also connect two independent clauses with an independent marker word, also called a coordinating conjunctive adverb, but that's kind of a mouthful. So I usually just like independent marker word. So the way that you can do that is it's the same sentence with the same clauses. So you have her favorite subject is biostatistics, but then you use a semicolon, an independent marker word, however, is one example of that. And then a comma, and then you have she also enjoys history. And when you want to connect an independent clause and a dependent clause, what you can do is you can use those dependent marker words that we just spoke about. And the way that you can do this is starting with an independent clause followed by a dependent clause. If you do that, you do not need a comma to separate the two of them. So an example of this is he sneezed whenever the cat walked by. That is you don't have to join them using a comma, but if you choose to start with a dependent clause, that's when you do have to use a comma. So whenever the cat walked by, comma, he sneezed. And we will definitely get more into this. Alrighty, so on to punctuation. So commas have a couple of different functions. One of them is to separate items in a list. So this is specifically referred to as the Oxford or the serial comma, and it is going to go between the items in your list. So as you can see up here, my favorite vegetables are broccoli, comma, onions, comma, and peppers. So you need to make sure that you have that comma in between onions and, otherwise it is grammatically incorrect. So an example of this is for the second one, let's say that we don't have the comma after JFK. The way that this sentence would read is, we invited the strippers, JFK and Stalin. So in that context, the strippers are JFK and Stalin, rather than inviting strippers, JFK, and Stalin. So that's the importance of the Oxford comma. Another way that commas are typically used is to introduce elements, and this is really important for creating flow in your writing and also kind of transitioning and linking ideas. So an example of this is in 2021, many restaurants reopened. And you're going to use a comma between that like time as well as the consequence of that. And then you can read the second example, and they can also add non-essential information. So a good way to figure out if the information is non-essential is if you can literally remove it from the sentence and it still makes sense. So in the first example, her friends, Hannah and Mia, brought her an ice cream cake on her birthday. So if we don't want to specify who her friends are, because that is non-essential information, the sentence still maintains its meaning by saying her friends brought her an ice cream cake on her birthday. So this is typically referred to as a positive phrase. That's just the fancy name for it, but that's like that additional information that you're going to be including. And you want to make sure that you always have a comma before and after. I think I saw a hand raised. Did someone have a question?
Yes, I wanted to ask, sometimes we have, I see that there are commas before an end. Okay, so I see here with JFK, okay. So sometimes that comma sometimes is not there or sometimes is there. Like, sorry if I missed it. Is there, does it have to be always after the end or before the end? I'm sorry.
Yes. So if you have, no, that's a great question. If you have items that are in a list and you have and then the last item in the list, you're going to always want to make sure that you have your comma after or like the comma right before and. So you're correct. Unless if you just did, like we invited the strippers and JFK, like you wouldn't put a comma before the and in that instance because it's just two things. But three or more things, you're always going to want to have that comma. Unless technically, if you wanted to like group those together, if you wanted to specify that like the strippers were JFK and Stalin, then you could do that by removing that comma after JFK. Does that make sense?
That does make sense. Thank you so much.
Okay, of course. Thank you for your question. All right, so back to positives, where another example, we have Ella Baker, comma, an influential civil rights activist, comma, used a non-traditional approach to leadership. So that's another way where you're adding additional information. And just to show you guys what it would also look like, similar to how we have the introductory elements, you can also start with the non-essential information. So an influential civil rights activist, comma, Ella Baker used a non-traditional approach to leadership. So that is also okay. Alrighty. So like we said a little bit before, commas are going to be used to separate your coordinating conjunctions. So it's going to go independent clause, comma, coordinating conjunction, and then your independent clause. So an example of this is the hikers traveled for miles and they arrived tired. So if you, like you can tell when you need to use a comma, if you could technically put a period after the hikers traveled for miles, period, and they arrived tired, period. That still works, like that still makes sense. It's just kind of choppy. So that's when you know that you need a comma, is because that and they arrived tired also includes a noun, it includes a verb, and it expresses a complete thought. If you didn't want to use a comma for that, the way that you could say it is the hikers traveled for miles and arrived tired, or and felt tired. So you know, because that second part, felt tired, doesn't have a noun, so it doesn't have a subject. So that is just additional information. It's not another independent clause. Alrighty. So onto our semicolons. So semicolons can be used to separate items in a list when multiple, well, one or multiple of the items also have a comma. So that's when you want to avoid having like 20 different commas in a sentence. You can use a semicolon. So in this instance, it is specifying like Reginald Mack, a district attorney, speak on victims' rights. Semicolon, Maria Mendoza, a professor of law, comma, speak on the court system. So because you have that additional information of their title, that's including additional commas, and to make it kind of clear for readers, the way that you can do that is you can just use a semicolon. Another way that you can use a semicolon is to link two independent clauses when you don't want to use a coordinating conjunction. So that is just going to go independent clause, semicolon, independent clause. And you want to use this when your two different clauses are of equal importance, or the second one is basically restating the first one. So in the second example, Jamie joined the swim team. She learned how to swim the backstroke and the breaststroke. So it sounds like semicolons are a little bit of a like softer pause than a period. So you could say Jamie joined the swim team, period. She learned how to swim the backstroke and the breaststroke. But because they are so closely related and they're both independent clauses, you can just connect them using a semicolon. All right, and another way that you can use a semicolon is to link two independent clauses with a coordinating conjunctive adverb, which is also just going to be your independent marker word. So that is the word that links to independent clauses, and it's going to come after a semicolon, and then you're going to put a comma after it. So examples of this are going to be however, therefore, nevertheless, and like the first one, so groceries from Jewel-Osco cost less than groceries from Whole Foods, semicolon, independent marker word, therefore, comma, I shop at Jewel-Osco to save money. And these are really good. The second sentence kind of points out that these are good at connecting more complex sentences. So rather than having and in between there, these create more like, I'd say I'd stray towards using semicolons if you have like lengthier sentences that you think are, that should be connected or related in some way. Okay, so on to our colons. So the function for colons is going to emphasize whatever comes after the colon. So you can use it to link independent clauses when you specifically want to draw attention at the second clause. So in this instance, Thomas Jefferson had a distinguished career in public service. He was the principal author of the Declaration of Independence, served as the third president of the United States, and founded the University of Virginia. So the second clause is really giving a lot of in-depth information about his distinguished career. So because you want to emphasize that, you can use a colon. What you can also do is you can introduce additional information after an independent clause. So colons are kind of, I feel like they're kind of dramatic. So if you like, go ahead and use them if you want to. So like only one thing scares me, semicolon, spiders. So that's drawing a lot of attention at spiders. And it's just a way that it catches your reader's eye if that's something that you want to do. Another way that you can use it is to introduce a quotation. And typically you do not need to capitalize the first word in the quotation, but Congress is a proper noun. So you're going to do that in this instance. And you can also introduce a list after an independent clause. So I want to emphasize only after an independent clause. So there are three primary colors, colon, yellow, red, and blue. Also notice our Oxford comma in there after red. This is a common thing that I feel like folks like doing correctly. So like you can't say there are 3 primary colors, comma, including, and then do semicolon, yellow, red, and blue. And you can't do that because adding including after that makes the clause dependent, and colons are going to be used after independent clauses. So that technically, if you add like specifically, including, that is going to make it dependent. So don't do that. Alrighty, on to our dashes. So dashes are a good way to break up a sentence or add emphasis, as well as to connect different words. So we have 2 different types. We have our M dash, and you can memorize that as, or help yourself remember, because M dashes are going to be longer, just like M's have 2 humps, and that's going to be longer, rather than the N dash, which only has, the N only has 1 hump, so it's going to be smaller. So your N dash is going to be used to denote like 2 or a range, as well as to indicate a connection between the words. So like pro-choice, pro-life, that is going to have to be dashed in between those words. Okay, and then the M dash is going to introduce additional information, but when you don't want to set it off with commas or parentheses, a lot of times folks will just kind of read over parentheses because, you know, we just assume that it's non-essential. So one way to avoid that and keep your readers engaged is to use an M dash. Oh, I should also go back here. So I wrote down how you can type that on your keyboard depending on what type of computer you have, just so you guys know, but quick Google search would also tell you. Okay, back here. So an example is my piano teacher, M dash, an exceptionally patient woman, M dash, was visibly agitated by my ham-fisted playing. And we have that N dash between ham-fisted. So you can also use these to set off a positive phrases. So like we talked about, when we don't want to have kind of like a mess of commas, what you can do is you can use an M dash, and that's going to add like non-essential information. So my 3 siblings, Kate, Eddie, and Lisa, drive me nuts. Or emphasis, that's another function of it, is your brother, no matter what he says, cannot make you do that. And that's also similarly non-essential, but it does add some additional context. In terms of punctuating for this, so I intentionally put a space before and after the first example, so the my piano teacher, and then we have that M dash. I put a space before and after that, as well as a space before and after the second M dash in that sentence. Compared to the other ones, I didn't use any spaces. So you can do it either way. It doesn't matter as long as you're consistent. So in the first example, if I have that like space before the M dash and space after, and then I just choose not to space the second M dash, that's going to be incorrect. So just make sure that you're consistent in how you're doing that throughout your sentence. Okay, so brief summary. The way that we can join 2 independent clauses is using a coordinating conjunction. So we are going to use a comma put in our coordinating conjunction, and then you can also connect it using a semicolon, and then you can additionally connect independent clauses using a coordinating conjunctive adverb and a semicolon. Okay, and I don't think that we will have time to get into this right now, but I did try to provide some examples of different ways that you can communicate the same content. These examples here are going to be, they're like run-ons. So you do need punctuation in between them. And then I just gave examples of different types of ways that you can punctuate them. Okay, so tips and tricks. Michael Scott here is saying, sometimes I'll start a sentence and I don't even know where it's going. I just hope I find it along the way. So we want to avoid that as much as we can in our academic writing. Every word in your writing should serve a purpose. A lot of times folks equate like the length of a paper with quality, and I don't think that that is an accurate assessment, because wordiness is actually something that's pretty common in academic writing, and it kind of detracts from what you're trying to say. So speaking of conciseness, we're going to go on to concision. And the goal of this is to communicate clearly, and we want to avoid redundancy. So one way that we can do that is delete redundant words. So the words that are in red don't add anything to the meaning. And they're pretty common phrases. Like I find myself using them. So just like there are lots of phrases that are used commonly in academia that are unnecessary. So you can like Google that, or you can just reference some examples here, but they were alike is the same as they were both alike. So there's no need to include both in there. Okay, and this is definitely my favorite office quote. Me think, why waste time, say lot word, when few word do trick. So we don't want to be wordy. We want to be concise. We're going to lose our audience's attention if we are excessively wordy. So again, here are some examples of wordier phrases, as well as the concise alternatives that are either one word or two words. So that is going to help engage your reader and keep their attention. So what do you know? What else do you do? Ways that you can minimize wordiness is you can avoid unnecessary modifiers. So that's going to be your really, very, severely. And this is why word choice is huge, because instead of saying really sad, you can say depressed, you can say apathetic, despondent. And that's going to be a better way to communicate that emotion rather than having that modifier, that like unnecessary modifier in front of sad. Another way that you can do this is you can trim down those who, that, or which phrases. So people who participated in the program had better health outcomes. Another way to just say that is program participants had better health outcomes. So you changed people who participated in the program to program participants. And then I have some additional examples below if you'd like to also look at those. Oh, I don't know why this one. Okay, sorry. So another way to make your rating stronger is to be specific. So a vague way to describe something is the company is developing a new consumer device that allows users to communicate vocally in real time. So like, what are they even talking about? Kind of is what I think when I read that sentence. A more specific way to say that is the company is developing a new cell phone. So we know exactly what it is that the writer is talking about. So when we talked about active and passive voice, and I mentioned to be verbs, this is why to be verbs are frequently, but not always, going to be passive voice. So they include is, are, am, was, were, being, been, and be. So rather than saying there is a student who's having difficulty with their essay, you can just make it more of an active sentence and say the student struggled with their essay. And then I have another example below. In the resources that I have listed at the end of the presentation, there is instructions on how to like get Microsoft Word to check your writing for passive voice. So that is a tool that is available for you. All right, so this is rating style per the American Psychological Association, the most like updated version, which is APA 7. So they recently approved the singular use of they or their when the gender is unknown, irrelevant, or someone identifies as non-binary. So rather than saying he or she, just say they. More concise, and it's also just more appropriate now. Similarly, rather than saying his or her, you can just say their. Alrighty, and then another way that, or another kind of update from APA 7 is using person first language. So rather than using adjectives to like function as a noun, so mentally ill should be an adjective and it shouldn't be used as a noun. So you don't want to say like the mentally ill. Instead, you're going to use it as a descriptive phrase. So people who are mentally ill. And you can typically identify if you're using person first language if the person is first. And I know that we did just speak about eliminating unnecessary modifiers and those like who, which, that phrases. But in this instance, it is more appropriate for you to use person first language. Additionally, how we talked about specificity, we want to be specific with our labels. So rather than saying Asian Americans, which is a very broad category, we want to specify Japanese Americans, or just be as specific as you can given the information that you have. So similarly, we also want to be specific with our age ranges. So rather than saying people over 50 years old, you want to specify the specific age range that you're referring to. So people, between the ages of 50 and 70 years old. Okay, so everyone's favorite, APA citations and references. So APA in-text citations are typically going to follow the basic format of parentheses, where you have the author's last name, followed by a comma, followed by the year. And then that's going to hold true when you have one author. When you have two, what you're going to do is you are going to have author one last name, that and sign, author two's last name, comma, and the year. When you have three or more authors, you're going to only use the first author's last name, and then you're going to do et al, which is just et space al period, comma, the year. In the instance that you want to reference two different sources within the same sentence, what you're going to do is you are going to order them alphabetically the way that they appear in your references. And you're going to just do the regular citation format. So where we have Jones, comma, 2020, and then you separate with a semicolon. And then you have your Musa and Smith separated by a comma, and then 2017. The way that we can use in-text when we use in-text citations, it is because we are either paraphrasing or using direct quotes. So for paraphrasing, it's not necessary to use the page number or include it. I would just suggest you save yourself the time and don't include it if it's not like readily available. So the way that you can do that is you can introduce the author. So we have Jones, and then we have the year, and that's 2020. And because we're describing the results, we're talking in the past tense. So we have found in association, ... Another way that you can do this is you can just summarize or paraphrase the research itself. And then at the end, you can add that in parentheses and that like basic format where you have Jones, comma, year. For our quotes, that is something where you need to include the page number. And if you don't have a page number, there are different ways that you can do it. You can like specify paragraphs by saying like it's PARAS dot 6 or something, if it's the sixth paragraph. But try your best to find page numbers. And the way that you can do this is you first introduce your author or your authors. Notice how, although we have two authors, the Musa and Smith, we are not using that and sign because the and sign is only going to go inside your like citation if you're using it in that context. So when you're just writing it out, just say and. That's the way that you want to approach it. So you introduce the authors, you have the year, then you have that comma before you have your quotation. So quotation mark, whatever it is you want to include, end of the quotation mark, and then you're going to have in parentheses, P dot, and then whatever page number you have, the end of the parentheses, and then you put your period at the end of that. So something that I didn't note in the paraphrasing example is you always have your punctuation after your in-text citation. So sometimes that seems a little bit unnatural because you ended your sentence, but you need to be clear that you're including that in-text citation refers to that sentence. So punctuation is going to go on the outside. Another thing to note for quotes is if you have a page range that you are referencing, the way that you would do that is you would do, instead of a single P, you would do P dot, and then you would do the number and just your end dash to the other, like whatever page numbers. So that's just something to know. All right, and then for APA 7 references, you want to have that on its own page. So just enter all the way down until it's got its own page. You're going to type out references, smack it on the center of the page, then you're going to alphabetize all of your references, and then you're going to use a hanging indent. I provided instructions on how to do that in Google Docs as well as Word, but your hanging indent literally just looks like it's hanging. So that's how you know. You'll have like a longer piece, and then the other ones are like slightly indented. The big changes from APA 6 are going to be that you only need to use retrieved from in your reference when the date is available or the contents of the source is likely to change. So I know we don't typically use Wikipedia, as we shouldn't in most academic writing, but in the event that you wanted to, reference Wikipedia, that would be something where you would need to include the retrieved from and that date. And another change is that we no longer include the publisher location, and DOIs are going to be presented as hyperlinks. So that's the https://. Okay, so the general format of our references is going to be our last name, comma, first initial. If they have a middle initial, then you're also going to include that, period. And then in parentheses, you have your date, which is going to be your year, comma, month, and date. A lot of times you do not have the month and date, you just have the year. That's okay, but when you have it available, be sure to include it. After your date, you're going to put a period, and then you're going to have your title of the page in italics, and then the site name and the URL. So something to note about capitalization for titles is you just want to capitalize the first word of the title as well as the first word of the subtitle. So the subtitles are typically going to come after a colon. Other than that, you only want to capitalize proper nouns. So the majority of your title, especially if it's long, is not going to be capitalized. The exception of this rule is periodical titles. So that's going to be, your Psychology Today, and we will have examples later too. So notice in the general website format that laziness does not exist is italicized, and does not exist is lowercase. If the website is written by an organization, which is really common for government or advocacy organizations, when they don't have specific authors, that's okay, don't worry. You're just going to use the group name as the author itself. So it's going to follow basically the same structure. And another thing that you should note is if there isn't an author and it's going to be your group or your organization name, and that name is the same as the site name, then you don't want to include the site name in that part of your reference. So here we have the American Society for the Prevention of Cruelty to Animals. And then we have our date, our title. Notice how case is uppercase as well as justice. And then where you normally would put your site name, in this instance, it's the same as the author, so you do not include it. Alrighty, and then if there's no author and no organization, you are just going to start with the title of the page. So in this example, it is Tuscan white bean pasta, and there is no associated author, so you don't need to include it. When there is no date, the way that you're going to do that is you're going to follow the same format, but you are not going to include a date. You are instead going to include in parentheses n.d. And make sure you have that period after the D too. Some people forget that. And this again is going to happen on a lot of government websites as well as advocacy websites, just because they're kind of broader and they don't necessarily specify the exact date. Okay, so we have DOIs and URLs. For folks who aren't familiar with DOIs, that basically is just a stable hyperlink, because a lot of times URLs are going to change or they're going to be removed. So it was just created to kind of have a permanent location on the internet for this article. So our online scholarly articles are going to fall into two different categories. So you have when the DOI is available, and then when the DOI is not available. So in the instance that it is available, what you're going to do is you're going to follow this format here, and you are going to, actually, I'll describe the format. So yeah, we have last name, first initial dot middle initial, when applicable, comma, and you would add any other additional authors. And then before the last author is when you're going to want to use that and sign. And you're going to do the last author's last name, first initial, middle name. Then you're going to do the year, the title of the article. In this instance, it's a little bit different than websites because you do not italicize the title of the article itself. You're going to be instead italicizing the title of the periodical as well as the volume. But you do keep the issue, which is in that parentheses right after. You keep that like normal. You don't italicize that. So I have an example below, and the way that you do the DOI is you have that DOI number, but you just add that HTTPS : those slashes to make it a hyperlink. And then the other category of online scholarly articles is going to be when you do not have a you do not have a DOI. So when it is published on a website, you are basically going to follow the same exact format, but you are going to include instead the website URL rather than the DOI. In the instance that you have no DOI, but it's not published on a website, it's published on a database, what you're going to do is you are just not going to include anything. So you're not going to include the DOI or the URL. And the format below just shows you what that's going to look like. And that is actually the same exact format that you use to cite like printed articles. Okay, I know we're almost out of time. Sorry, I've been talking a lot. I'm going to try to go quick so we can go over some resources. But for online lecture notes or presentation slides, it's going to follow basically the same format, and then you have the title of the presentation. You don't want to capitalize basically anything other than the first word or the first word of the subtitle, as well as your proper nouns. So that's going to be the same. And then the difference is going to be in brackets. You need to specify what the file format of this presentation is. So was it PowerPoint slides? Was it a Word document? And then you're also going to you're going to include the publisher as well as the URL. For electronic books, you are going to follow last name, comma, first initial, middle initial, and then title of book. And then if the ebook edition is different than the print edition, then that's when you're going to want to include in brackets ebook edition. But when they're the same, don't feel like you need to include that. You only need to indicate that if the content is different. And again, you want to include your URL for that. So resources, you guys have a lot of resources. These are specific ones that are just online. Grammarly is my go-to resource. I love it. It has add-ins for desktop, Microsoft. You can add it in on Chrome, on Macs, and that is just going to go over and it's going to look for grammatical and punctuation errors, and it's going to offer suggestions. They have a free version as well as a premium version that costs money. If you have been in an appointment with me, you know that a lot of times we will, like, you'll share a Google Doc with me and then I'll share my screen and we'll look at what Grammarly has to say and then go over it together, because it is a great resource. But also be mindful, sometimes it's wrong. Just like the automatic citation generators are sometimes wrong. So another resource that I briefly mentioned before was Microsoft, that will check for passive versus active voice in your writing. So the hyperlink here is going to link you to instructions on how to get that. And then, as well as just general grammar and punctuation resources I have under there. Those are great websites. Purdue OWL is also great. In terms of citations and references, you have RefWorks. We get that free as students. So that is just a citation manager. I personally don't use it, so I'm not super familiar, but I know that our librarians are great resources if that's something that you're interested in. We also have additional resources that are available, like videos. I try to just briefly explain them. Feel free to email me though if you're finding that these aren't as helpful as you need, and I will help you look for additional ones, or we can just meet and talk through whatever content it is that you'd like more practice with. In terms of resources that are specific at UIC, you have the Library of Health Sciences. So Rosie Haneke is a great resource for citations and references, and I believe that Tina Griffin is more specific to the data management as well as gathering, but also a great resource. The Rating Center is free and they offer in-person as well as virtual tutoring sessions. I linked the website there. And then I also provided some exercises that are listed on here, and you can just go through and practice. Practice is literally what I just have to practice all the time to improve my writing. So I highly suggest it if you have the time and that's something that you would like to improve. And then there was additional content that was requested by a couple of folks who registered that I wasn't able to get in to fit within this tiny time frame. So I just wanted to bring attention to that. And yeah, thank you guys so much for coming. I really, really appreciate you listening. We talk about grammar and punctuation for an hour. I am here for you. If you need any assistance in the writing process, please feel free. I am an available resource for undergraduates to doctoral students. I'm also a student, so I know what it's like. I feel ya, and we can work through this together. If you have any questions, feel free to email me at this email address. ODI's website also, well, the School of Public Health's ODI website also has information on the whole peer support team. So if you're finding that you also need support with quantitative work, then feel free to reach out to our two lovely quantitative specialists. Another shout out to them is that we do have a quantitative methods for IPHS 402 midterm review workshop tomorrow. So that's going to be from 6 to 8 p.m. And that is going to go over a lot of the content that will be covered on the exam, just great practice. And the link I also have here. I do ask that if you have the time, you please complete the post survey. That's super helpful for me. And I would just really appreciate any feedback so I can make these better in the future and hopefully address whatever needs, students have. So without further ado, I'm going to stop sharing my screen. And I can put the link to the post survey in the chat if anyone is able to stay on. But I'm also going to send it in a follow-up meeting. And Yes, sorry, I did not see these questions. Yes, I will 100% be sending out these slides, and I will also be sending out the recording of this. So please feel free to reference the slides. Again, if you have any questions, also reach out. But thank you so much for your time. All righty.